Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are going to finish our book, Among the Impostors, today, where we just left off. Jason, Jackalboy, whatever his name is, he has just been taken by the population police. Mr. Talbot was there and kind of was able to make sure that the other boys that he had called out didn't get taken. He even had a picture of Lee, or Luke, in his wallet saying he's known him since he was a little boy. Mr. Talbot, he amazes me more and more each time that we see him because he goes from being like a bad guy to a good guy. Like, I think he's a good person. What he just did seems like a good person, but like them taking Jason, like I don't even know. Okay, let's figure out what happens at the end of this book. Let's get going. So, chapter 36. It was strange after everything that had happened. The boys couldn't shuffle off to their classes as usual. The boys could shuffle off to their classes as usual. The hall monitors watched as usual. Once the bell rang, the teachers cleared their throats as dryly as ever and began lecturing about integral numbers or laws of thermodynamics or long-dead poets. Luke took his history exam that afternoon, as scheduled. He was surprised that he could pencil in responses about Hercules and Achilles, Hannibal and Arthur, heroes of the distant past, even as his mind raced with questions about the present. He longed to ask Patrick Tyrone, no, that made Robert now, for an explanation, or any of the others. How had they known the right names to say? How had their records been changed? How was it that nobody in the entire room had stood up to challenge their stories? And who had betrayed Jason? But each time he saw the other boys, they only groaned about their exam, complained about the school food, told stupid jokes. They acted like their names had always been Michael, Robert, Joel, and John. Nobody mentioned Jason. Are we going to the woods tonight? Luke whispered to Trey as they were leaving dinner. To talk about, Luke looked at him as though Luke was speaking a foreign language. Guess not, huh? Luke said, unable to just let it go. Luke felt an arm on his shoulder just then. I'd like a word with you, young man, a voice said. With all his fears from breakfast time rushing back, Luke had to force himself to turn around. Mr. Dirk, his history teacher, stood there, looking stern. You are Lee Grant, are you not? Mr. Dirk asked. The other boy stepped past him. Luke watched the doors of the lecture hall close before he could bring himself to nod. Then come with me, Mr. Dirk said, and turned on his heel. Luke followed a few paces behind, so Mr. Dirk was going to tell him how badly he failed the history exam. So what? Luke remembered that, with Jason gone, there was no one to doctor his grades. But Luke had never cared about the grades. I'll work harder on the next term, Luke started to say. I didn't even start going to your class until last week. Hush, Mr. Dirk said. Luke fought his urge to giggle. It was so ridiculous that after surviving the population police raid, he was getting in trouble because he had forgotten the names of a few dead guys because most guys people had never heard of. Mr. Dirk walked past his classroom. Luke started to protest, but Mr. Dirk was walking briskly now. Luke had to hurry to keep up with Mr. Dirk, walking right up to the front door and turned the knob. Isn't it locked tonight? Luke wanted to ask, but he was beginning to understand that Mr. Dirk wasn't going to scold him about ancient history. He kept his mouth shut. The door opened easily. Luke and Mr. Dirk stepped outside together. Tiers of steps lay before them in the twilight. Luke remembered his trepidation climbing these very stairs, his first day at Hendricks. They didn't seem quite so imposing now, probably because he was at the top looking down instead of the bottom looking up. Where are we going? Luke couldn't resist asking. For an answer, Mr. Dirk put a finger to his lips. They climbed down the steps and walked along the expansive driveway. June bugs sang far off in the distance. They made Luke homesick. Back on the farm, his dad and brothers were probably just coming in from supper after a hard day of baling. Mother would just be getting home from the factory. It didn't seem right that Luke had just had one of the most terrifying days of his life, and his own family would never know. Watch your step, Mr. Dirk said. Luke had been so lost in thought he didn't even notice that they had turned and were now standing in front of a small cottage. No, not a cottage. The small scale had fooled him. This building had turrets and arches like a castle, but was nestled so neatly behind lilac bushes and rhododendron and forsythia that Luke could have walked right past without seeing it all. Ring the bell, Mr. Dirk instructed. He turned to go. Luke was swept with panic. Wait, he cried. Mr. Dirk was hardly a comforting figure, but at least he was familiar. Luke didn't like being abandoned in a strange place without an explanation. I can trust you can find your way back on your own when you're finished, Mr. Dirk said, and then disappeared into the shadows. There was nothing for Luke to do but press the doorbell. Come in, a deep voice called from inside. Luke gave the door a little push. It was made of the same kind of heavy wood as all the other doors at Hendrick's. It barely moved. Timidly, Luke edged it open and stepped inside. A dim room lay before him. Prisms hung from old-fashioned lamps. Wood-framed couches curved between oddly shaped tables cluttered with dozens of framed pictures. Luke didn't even notice the man in the wheelchair until he cleared his throat. Welcome, young man, the man said. He was older than either Luke's parents or Mr. Talbot. He had thick white hair that swelled above his forehead like a snowbank. He wore crisp khaki pants and a pale blue shirt, the same kind of barren clothes Luke had almost become accustomed to wearing himself. Would you care for a drink? Bottled water, perhaps? Luke shook his head, baffled. Questions swarmed in his mind. George, the man called. Mr. Talbot stepped into the room from the back part of the house. Luke's knees went weak with relief. Finally, someone who could explain. Mr. Luke began, but Mr. Talbot shook his head warningly. He waved a long bar in front of Luke's chest and arms and legs, and then began his back. Finally, he leaned back and announced, He's clean, no bugs. I hate all this technology, don't you? The man in the wheelchair said, leaning back as though Mr. Talbot's announcement had freed him to relax. He stirred a cup he held in his hand. Luke thought he caught a whiff of something like chicory coffee his parents had sometimes drunk as a special treat. But now I can introduce myself. I'm Josiah Hendricks. You know my friend here, I presume. Luke could only nod. Sit down, Mr. Hendricks said. No need to stand on ceremony. Luke noticed that Mr. Talbot, always so much in charge of every other time Luke had seen him, obeyed instantly. Luke quickly sank into an armchair as well. Mr. Hendricks sipped his drink. You are an inquisitive young man, he said to Luke. You wish some explanations, no? Yes, Luke said eagerly. He looked over at Mr. Talbot expectantly. But Mr. Talbot was staring pointedly at Mr. Hendricks. Once I was a very rich man, Mr. Hendricks said. I spent my money foolishly. Who doesn't when they have more money than when they know what to do with? There's a long and not particularly attractive story about how I spent my younger days, but suffice it to say, I was given reason to develop compassion by the time of the great famines. He looked down quickly. Luke saw for the first time that both of his pant legs hung empty from below the knee. I'm not disguising anything for you tonight, Mr. Hendricks said softly. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his own chair. What was he supposed to say? Evidently nothing. Mr. Hendricks went on with his tale. You know the government was considering letting the undesirables starve, do you not? Mr. Hendricks asked. When there's not enough food, who deserves to eat? The blind girl? Or the deaf boy? The man missing his legs? Then the anger in his voice was unbearable. Luke stumbled over his own tongue, ready to say anything to move the story along. Jason, I mean the one taken away this morning. He told me about that. At school. Indeed, Mr. Hendricks said. He seemed lost in thought, then roused himself to continue. My family and I spent millions on bribes to convince the government to have a heart. They left the disabled alone and they passed the population law instead. He frowned, stirring his coffee. And how compassionate had I been? I saved my own kind, knowing that others would likely be killed, so I set up the school as a penance. Mr. Hendricks foresaw that what others did not, Mr. Talbot said. He understood that hundreds of illegal children would be born and hidden, and he knew they'd need safe places to go if they were able to come out of hiding. But I thought your schools were for autistic kids with phobias, the ones who... Luke stopped. Oh, he said. Mr. Hendricks chuckled. So my charade fooled you, he said. Who can tell if a child rocks because he has autism or because he's terrified out of his wits? Who can tell if agoraphobia is caused by oddities in the mind or lifelong warnings? Go outdoors is suicide. In the beginning, yes, I accepted children whose problems stemmed from other causes. I nurtured a reputation as a schoolmaster who would take on any troubled child. And when the first illegal children began emerging, they came here too. Luke tried to grasp it all. So everyone's an ex-nay? And everyone knows? He asked. The teachers, Miss Hawkins in the office, the nurse, all the other boys? Oh no, Mr. Hendricks shook his head empathetically. My charade is complete. I don't even know for sure which boys are which. I don't want to know. There is the possibility of torture, Mr. Talbot said grimly. Those I don't know I can't betray, Mr. Hendricks said. And I hire only employees who seem uniquely capable of ignorance. Teachers so enamored of their own academic disciplines that they can't even recognize the students who sit before them for an entire year. Administrative staff whose incompetence is of such towering magnitude that they can't input records into computers won't notice when files are faked or replaced. There's a certain charm to my system, is there not? Luke remembered how Jason's portable phone had disappeared, how the doors had been locked, how the files under his 4 friends' new fake names had magically appeared. But someone knows, he insisted. There has to be a someone who oversees it all. Mr. Hendricks shifted in his wheelchair. Oh, yes, I have my compatriots. Mr. Dirk, as you probably suspect, has been useful upon occasion, although his knowledge is limited. I will tell you no other names. Luke should have felt relieved to finally get an explanation. For all that matter, he should have been ecstatic to have an adult at Hendricks acknowledge his existence. But all he could think about suddenly was how lonely and isolated he'd felt the first few weeks at Hendricks, how invisible, how low he'd sunk, and that he'd almost looked forward to Jason picking on him each evening. He felt a surge of anger. You think you're so great, he said before he could stop himself. Don't you know how it feels to be an ex-nay? And then you could abandon us among people who don't care or can't care? It's a wonder we don't all run back into hiding. Oh no, Mr. Hendricks said, seemingly totally unruffled by Luke's outburst. You were never abandoned. I can assume you've never been deep-sea diving, correct? Luke shook his head and resisted the urge to roll his eyes as well. But you understand the concept, Mr. Hendricks didn't wait for a reply. When a diver resurfaces, he has to go gradually so his body can get accustomed to the change in pressure. Children coming out of hiding need that too. They need places to adjust to the outside world. Somewhere that their extreme fear of the outdoors does not seem out of place. Somewhere that they can act antisocial and not stand out. Somewhere, well, like Hendricks. And when they're ready, they move on. You mean leave? Luke asked, his voice squeaking in spite of himself. Yes, Mr. Talbot said. And Mr. Hendricks and I agree. The events of the past 24 hours prove that your time has come. You're ready to go. Huh? Luke said. He had not anticipated that turn of the conversation at all. Mr. Hendricks leaned forward. My school has never been infiltrated before, he said, with a sharp glance at Mr. Talbot. Mr. Talbot frowned apologetically. The population police have always pretended that it's impossible for any legal child to get a fake ID, Mr. Talbot added. But after the rally, his eyes clouded. Luke could see the effort he was making to continue without emotion. After the rally, all the rules changed. So you see, we never expected betrayal, Mr. Hendricks said. In the beginning, yes, we tiptoed and looked over our shoulders, and fortunately, we kept habits of strong security. But we were not prepared for the population police to plant impostors in our midst, to gather names to encourage indiscretion. Luke frowned. But Jason said there had been raids before. He said... Mr. Talbot had a sarcastic smile on his face. Mr. Hendricks raised one eyebrow. My dear boy, Mr. Hendricks said. He lied. Luke grimaced. He didn't like them acting like he couldn't figure out this on his own. But he'd learned a lot from Jason. What was true and what was false? He remembered one of Jason's other explanations. You can't be too nice to an ex-nay. Ex-nays need the kind of friend who can toughen them up, like I did for you. Luke remembered how many times Jason had made him claim to be an idiot, to do push-ups until his arms collapsed, make a total fool of himself. Jason hadn't been trying to toughen Luke up. He'd been trying to break him down. But it hadn't worked. Luke didn't know why. He felt breathless, thinking about what could have happened. Suddenly he was mad at Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot, sitting there looking so condescending. Why didn't you know Jason was an imposter? Luke said. You should have. He acted so differently from everyone else. Yes. And so did you, Mr. Hendricks replied quickly. Should we have suspected you of working for the population police just because you liked going outside? Luke blinked. Yes, we knew, Mr. Hendricks said, just as we knew Jason, as you called him, was forming a club of former hidden children. We'd never seen that happen before, and frankly, we viewed it as a positive development, until you showed us the truth. Luke remembered how frustrated and frightened and alone he'd felt only the night before. I didn't do anything, he said. I tried, but nothing worked. Mr. Talbot deserves all the credit. You stopped the infiltrator and knocked him out. Then you took him to the nurse who, under the school's protocol, had to alert me, Mr. Hendricks said. She thought he was just another former hidden child going through some very unusual trauma. But when he muttered, my phone, she got suspicious. We locked all the doors and made a search of the entire school building. So that's what Jason had muttered to the nurse, Luke thought. He was kind of glad now that he hadn't heard. He had felt panicked enough as it was. Once we confiscated his phone, Mr. Hendricks continued, we found that the last number he called was the population police. Meanwhile, your call made George here suspicious. Without spilling everything for the bugs on my phone, thank you very much, Mr. Talbot said. Because of your warning, I had time to double-cross the population police's efforts. So we arrested 2 traitors instead of 6 former hidden children. A good trade in my mind. Luke felt dizzy. No matter how many explanations Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks gave him, other questions sprang up in his mind, like so many weeds. Both men were watching him. Nina, Luke finally said. Nina was the other traitor. Yes, Mr. Talbot said. Luke thought about how, just for one second, he'd mistaken Nina for Jen that first night out in the woods. He'd wanted to like Nina so badly. He liked the way she'd laugh, but she had been a traitor too. What will happen to them? Luke asked. Jason and Nina, I mean. Mr. Talbot looked away. Sometimes it's better not to know, he murmured. That meant they were going to be killed, Luke thought. Killed or tortured to death, which was even worse. He shivered. Was it his fault? Was there some way he could have saved the other Xnays without destroying Jason and Nina? No, they were the ones who had chosen betrayal. This is a cruel business, Mr. Talbot said. Don't dwell on it. In the corner of a room, an old-fashioned clock ticked quietly. Luke gathered his thoughts for his next question. But why did the population police believe you instead of Jason? If he wanted to, that officer could have arrested all of us, Luke said. He remembered how careful Mr. Talbot had to be ever since the rally for fear someone might connect him with Jen. I thought you were out of favor at the population police headquarters right now. No offense, of course, he added quickly. Mr. Talbot shrugged as though being out of favor was as insignificant as a mosquito bite. I had the evidence on my side, he said. They like evidence. And I have to say, it was a stroke of brilliance to computer enhance that Christmas picture to substitute your face over Jen's. He kept his voice even, saying Jen's name, but Luke noticed that Mr. Hendricks bowed his head reverently, as though giving in to a moment of silent mourning. Had Mr. Hendricks ever even met Jen? Luke didn't know, but he found himself lowering his head as well. Jen would have liked that, Luke said, using her picture to fool the population police. He swallowed what might have been a giggle. Jen would have been very amused. And what better way to remember those we love than by doing what they like? Mr. Hendricks asked. Mr. Talbot nodded silently. Mr. Hendricks took over the explanation. And young man, you do not realize the power of the name you have been given. Lee Grant. Your father, the father listed on your school records, is a very important man in our society, he said. But he's not my father, Luke said, more forcefully than he intended. I've never met the man, and I'm not Lee Grant. Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot exchanged glances. Luke wondered if they were deciding he wasn't so ready after all. But you know how to pretend to be Lee Grant, Mr. Hendricks said. That is what matters. Luke shook his head impatiently. He'd suddenly had it all with this double talk. None of this was real, not the way planting potatoes was or growing beans. It was easier to be a farmer, to know by looking whether your crops were good or not. Still, another question teased at the back of his mind. Why did they do it, he asked. Jason and Nina, why did they betray their friends, their fellow Xnays? They were never your friends, Mr. Hendricks said harshly. They came to Hendricks and Harlow schools with one purpose, and one purpose only, to seek out and betray all the former hidden children they could. They preyed upon all the Xnays' secret desire to speak their real name because the population police needed the real names to complete the betrayal. Jason and Nina had never been hidden children. They were just plants. Impostors. But the population police said they were illegals with false documents, Luke said. The population police can lie too, Mr. Hendricks said grimly. It suits the government's purposes to say they're arresting third children rather than traitors. Luke tried to absorb this. Nina, who spoke so passionately about the third children's cause, Jason, who had talked about protecting Xnays at Hendricks, They had never been in hiding themselves. They only wanted to harm the ones who trusted them the most. This was a level of evil Luke could have never imagined before, back on the farm. And now Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot wanted him to go to a new place, someplace even more challenging than Hendricks. With all due respect to my friends here, Mr. Talbot noted towards Mr. Hendrick, we don't really know how Jason and Nina came to work for the population police or why they came to these schools. We're mostly guessing. They're just kids after all. Just kids? Mr. Hendricks protested. You think only adults are capable of such villainy? Naturally, adults must have to put them up to it, but I'll be interrogating both of them tomorrow, Mr. Talbot interrupted quietly. Let's just say I intend to discover facts that my population police colleagues probably don't want me to know. It's likely that those two kids were offered substantial bribes for their work. Or, he laughed, maybe they were true believers devoted to their cause. Who knows? Luke wondered about that. Long ago, when he'd first met Jen, he wondered if the population law was correct. If maybe he really didn't have any right to exist, to eat food that might go to others. But Jen had convinced him that wasn't so, that everyone had a right to live, no matter what. What if Jason and Nina had truly believed in what they were doing, even among their enemies, just as Mr. Talbot believed in what he was doing, double-crossing the population police, even as he worked in their headquarters every day? Luke rubbed his temples. This wore his brain out even more than the history test had. He wished everyone could just be what they were and not have to pretend. The clock in the corner began donging, giving off distinguished silvery peals. Luke read the time effortlessly, without having to count dongs. 8 o'clock. Well, Mr. Talbot said, rising, you'll need to get your things out of your room before the other boys come out of, what do you call it, indoctrination? And then I can drive you to your next school tonight. I'll tell you about it on the way. No, Luke said. Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks looked at him in bafflement. Then Mr. Hendricks chuckled. Oh, so you boys have come up with another name for it besides indoctrination? Luke understood the old man's confusion. He could go with that, make up some silly name for indoctrination, pretend that it wasn't what he was objecting to, but it wasn't. No, Luke said firmly. I mean, I don't want to leave Hendricks. Now Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks absolutely gaped at him, thoroughly aghast. Luke could tell that they were thinking, we gave him a new identity. We gave him a place to hide. We saved his skin today, and now he tells us no? How dare he? Luke gulped. He wasn't so sure how he dared either. Only 2 months earlier, when he'd left home, he'd been a scared little kid, afraid even to speak. He had borrowed a name and borrowed clothes, nothing but memories to call his own. But those memories were worth something, and so was he. He wasn't some pawn to be moved across the chessboard, according to other people's plans. Luke thought about what he had accomplished at Hendricks, not just what he'd done to help outsmart Jason, but what he'd done making his garden, trying to make friends, studying for his tests. Jen, you'd be proud, he thought. He tried to figure out how to explain to Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot. I'm glad you want to help me, Luke started softly, and I'm honored that you think I'm ready to leave, but I don't think I'm done here. When I came out of hiding, I told my parents that I wanted to help other third children. Only I didn't know how. But I do now. I want to help them here. Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot exchanged glances. Then Mr. Talbot sat down. Tell us more. Chapter 38. The sun was barely over the horizon, but it was already a steamy day. Luke brushed sweat out of his eyes and pushed another seed into the ground. It was late into the season to plant a garden, but they'd had to wait until after exams. Luke could only hope for a late frost in the fall. Behind Luke, 4 other boys clutched a sturdy rope stretched across the garden rows. One boy dipped quickly towards the ground, dropping a seed before he straightened up. Good, Trey, Luke said, laughing, but it's easier if you open your eyes. I might see something that way, Trey grumbled. Everything's so bright out here. Just smell then, Luke suggested. Trey breathed deeply. It's so fresh, he said in a marveling voice. Wait until you taste the peas you're planting, Luke said. Luke was still surprised that Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot had agreed to his plan. I never intended to run an agricultural school, Mr. Hendricks had grumbled. Some of these boys are from the richest families. or supposedly the richest families. Then they need to know how foods grow as much as anyone, Luke answered, surprised at his own tone of authority. Sometimes Luke wondered if he was just taking the easy way out, staying at Hendrix because it was familiar, growing a garden because that's what he liked. But the population law had started over food, so nobody could say that growing food wasn't important. Or maybe that was the problem, that people had started believing it wasn't important. Luke watched Trey plant another seed, this time with his eyes open. This little thing is really going to grow? Trey asked incredulously. Luke nodded. It ought to, he said, and it'll be yours. He hadn't been able to tell Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot how much longer he wanted to stay at Hendricks School. Last week's exam had pointed out plenty of holes in his education, and he knew now that he could learn here. And no matter what, it had to be good for the other boys to get outside. Are you some kind of teacher? One of the boys behind Trey asked Luke. He spoke hesitantly, like a little kid just learning to talk. What's your name? Just call me Al, Luke said without thinking. Now, where did that come from? It wasn't Luke. It wasn't Lee. It was, somehow, both identities at once, just like Luke himself. So that is where this book ends. The next one, there is a little preview into the next one, and I'm sure if I was in class with all of you, some of you would be like, read it, read it, read it. And some of you would be like, I want to be done. So if you want to end the video now, you can, or we'll start the next book, which is Among the Betrayed, which is the next one from the Shadow Children series. It'll be Among the Hidden series here. So Nina stood beside Lee Grant, pulling corn from a row of stalks. Leave the small ears to grow, Lee cautioned. We only need enough for the feast tonight. Only, Nina laughed. There'll be 20 people there. 40 ears, then, Lee countered. That's not much. Back home, when my mom was canning corn, we used to pick. What? 40 million? Nina teased. And the days since she'd been caught, she'd been staying at Mr. Hendricks' house with Percy, Matthias, and Elia. But she'd spent a lot of time with Lee and already listened to dozens of back-home stories. She didn't know what it was like at Harlow School for girls, but at Hendricks, boys were not pretending so much to be their fake identities. They were telling the truth more. Nina jerked another ear from a stalk. Anyway, forget 40 ears, she said. If you're figuring 2 per person, that's only 38. I don't think I'll ever be able to eat corn again. Not after the way you scared me in the garden last week, mid-bite. More for me, Lee said, clowning a selfish grab all around all the corn that they'd picked so far. Nina wondered if this was how normal children acted, children who'd never had to hide. She guessed she'd have a chance to find out now. She, Percy, Matthias, and Elia were being sent on to another school, one where third children with fake IDs mixed with firstborns and secondborns. That was why they were having a feast tonight, a combination of a celebration and a farewell. Given how things happened, Harlow School is probably not the best place for you anymore, Mr. Hendricks had told Nina. Nina had another flash of remembering that horrific cannon of eyes, watching her walk to her doom. I think I can forgive the other girls, she said, now. But are they ready to forgive you? Mr. Hendricks asked. No matter how much you reassure them, how much the officials reassure them, there will always be someone who suspects that you just got off and that you were really working with Jason. They haven't grown up like you have. Nina understood. She wasn't the same lovesick, easily terrified child she'd been at Harlow School. That was why she liked talking to Lee now. He'd grown up a lot too. The other boys looked up to him. They didn't even call him Lee anymore. He was the mostly LG, and they said it reverently. Nina still called him Lee. She didn't like too many things changing. Nina, Lee said now, slowly peeling back the husk of an ear of corn to check for rat. Before you leave tomorrow, there's something I've been wanting to tell you. What? Lee tossed the ear of corn onto the pile with the rest. It must have been okay. I've been thinking about Jason, he said. Nina stiffened just hearing that name. She might be able to forgive her friends at Harlow, but she wasn't ready to forgive Jason. So, she said. Well, I was thinking about what I heard him say on the phone to the police that night he was turning everyone in. He made it sound like you were working with him. I know, Nina said. That's how I ended up in prison. She couldn't keep the bitterness out of her voice. In one clean jerk, Lee pulled another ear from another stalk. But I don't think Jason was saying that to get you in trouble. He didn't expect to be arrested, to have you arrested. He meant for the illegal third children with fake IDs to be arrested. I think. I think he was actually trying to save you. Nina reeled backward, stunned beyond words. Lee took one look at Nina's face and kept explaining. Don't you see, she said. It wouldn't have made any sense for Jason to say you were working with him if he wanted to get you in trouble. He thought he and you were going to be rewarded. He was maybe trying to protect you from ever being turned in by anyone else. See, if years from now someone accused you of being illegal, he could pop up and say, Nina? How could Nina be an ex-nay? She helped turn them in. Lee did such a good job of intimidating Jason's voice that Nina could almost believe, but only almost. He was doing something wrong. Evil. He wanted innocent kids to die, she said harshly. She pulled so hard on an ear corn that the whole stalk came out of the ground. Lee frowned but didn't say anything about his precious cornstalk. Yeah, believe me, I was pretty mad at Jason myself, but I'm just saying, I don't think he was all bad. I think he, really liked you, and that was why he was trying to save you. Nina stood still, trying to make sense of Lee's words. It flip-flopped everything she thought for the past few months. How could she accept Lee's explanation? How could Jason have been so evil yet tried to save her? For a minute, she almost believed. Then she remembered. Mr. Talbot had a tape, she said dully, of Jason confessing, and he was lying and saying it was all my fault, that I was the one who wanted to turn in the ex-nays. Oh, Mr. Talbot could have faked that tape, Lee said. I've seen him fake pictures. But it was Jason's voice, Nina said. I heard him. I heard the tape. Lee turned back to the garden. Go ask him, he asked with a shrug. Nina stood still for a moment. Then she dropped her corn and took off running. Hope swelled in her heart. She burst into Mr. Hendricks' cottage and dashed into the living room where Mr. Hendricks and Mr. Talbot were conferring. The tape, she said, of Jason betraying me, lying. Was it real? Mr. Talbot turned around, looked at her blankly. You had a tape, she repeated, breathlessly, in prison, of Jason saying it was my idea to betray the ex-nays, my idea to turn them into the population police. Did he really say that, or did you fake the tape? Mr. Talbot blinked. Does it matter, he asked. Of course it matters, Nina shrieked. If Mr. Talbot, he raised one eyebrow. Why, he said. Nina had so many reasons. They jumbled together. If he didn't betray me, if he was really trying to help me, then he really loved me. Then Auntie Zenka was right, and love is everything. The world's a good place, and I could be happy remembering him. But if he betrayed me, how could I think about the time we had together without hating him? How can I ever trust anyone, ever again? You've believed for months that he betrayed you, Mr. Talbot said, and you still trusted Percy, Matthias, and Elia. You've been acting like you trust Lee and Trey, Mr. Hendricks, and me, don't you? Yes, but Nina couldn't explain. Maybe I shouldn't trust you. You've lied to me a lot. Nina was both burst out laughing. It's not funny, she protested. Mr. Talbot stopped laughing and sighed. Nina, we lived in complicated times. I would have loved it if that first time I talked to you in your prison cell, I could have come out straight and said, here's the deal. I hate the population police. What about you? And it would have been great if I could have been sure that you would give me an honest answer. But can you really see that happening? Don't you see how muddy everyone's intentions get? How people end up doing the wrong things for the right reasons and the right things for the wrong reasons? And all any of us can do is try our hardest and have faith in that somehow, someday, it'll all work out. Nina looked down at her hands, still splotched with mud from the garden. She looked back up. Was the tape faked or not? She asked again. Mr. Talbot looked straight back at her. It was fake, he said quietly. Some of our tech people spliced it together. A grin burst over Nina's face. So Lee was right. Jason did love me, she whispered in wonderment. Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks exchanged glances in such a way that Nina felt like she was back with Percy, Matthias, and Elia. So that's enough for you, Mr. Talbot asked. It doesn't matter that Jason was trying to get other kids killed. You don't care about the evil he did, as long as he loved you. Nina's smile slipped, and why did Mr. Talbot have to confuse everything again? No, she said. That's not what I believe. This just means he wasn't all bad. He's dead anyways, so hold on to the good memories and let go of being mad at him. She wondered what had made Jason the way he was. She remembered how desperate she'd felt in the jail cell when she'd been so tempted to betray Percy, Matthias, and Elia. What if Jason had been even more desperate? What if he hadn't wanted to betray anyone either, but he had become too weak to resist? It was odd to think of Jason as weak. She could actually feel sorry for him now. She could hold on to that forever, the way she held on to memories of Graham and the aunties. Nina, Mr. Talbot said, Jason isn't dead. I thought they had executed him, but it turns out that another faction of the population police thought he still might be useful. I've only recently found out he's working for the population police in some top secret project, something we who oppose the government are very concerned about. He paused for a second as if waiting for the news to sink in. So what does that information do for you? Are you going to rush to his side, help him because he loves you? Nina stared at Mr. Talbot in amazement. He's alive? She whimpered. He's alive? Strangely, this seemed like bad news. If Jason were dead, she could go all misty-eyed remembering him, daydreaming in what might have been, just like Auntie Zenka mooning over one of her books. But with him alive and working for the population police? I have to stay mad, she said aloud. I can't ever forgive him. Bitter is a bad way to live, Mr. Talbot said. Nina remembered that he had lost Jen, and that he had reasons to stay angry at the government forever. She sank down onto one of Mr. Hendrick's couches. This was all going to overwhelm her. She was just a little girl who spent most of her life hiding, listening to old ladies' foolish stories. Or had they been foolish? All the fairy tales Gran and the aunties had told her were about people staying true to what was right in the face of great adversity. She'd heard the wrong part of the stories if she thought she was supposed to sit around like a princess, waiting for some prince to fall in love with her. She looked straight at Mr. Talbot. I don't want to stay bitter, but I want to help you. What can I do to make sure Jason's project fails? Mr. Talbot almost smiled. Nina felt like she passed another test. We'll see, he said. We'll see. Nina went back out toward Lee's garden to finish picking corn. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows over the path. Just about every step Nina took alternated between sunlight and dark. Nina's thoughts bounced back and forth as dramatically. Jason did love me. That's what really matters. But he was still evil. Why did I say I'd help Mr. Talbot oppose the government? How could have I not said that after everything Mr. Talbot did for me? What can I possibly do anyways? As Nina approached the garden, she saw Lee waiting for her there. Whatever she did for Mr. Talbot, she realized she would not be alone. Lee would probably be involved, and so would Percy and Matthias and Elia. Nina remembered how alone she felt in her jail cell and all those months ago. Feeling abandoned and betrayed was worse than hunger, worse than cold, worse than handcuffs on her wrists. But she hadn't been abandoned. She had only accidentally been betrayed. Well, Lee said, as soon as she got close enough to hear. Was I right? It took Nina a moment to remember what she was asking about. The tape. Jason's betrayal. It's a long story, Nina said, and it's not over yet. But part of her story was over. The part where she was innocent and stupid and useless. She'd been so worried that people might not remember her as Elodie, sweet, loving, little girl Elodie. But she'd outgrown Elodie. She'd outgrown Nina, the ninny, too. She was ready now to make whatever name she carried one that people would respect and revere, like Jen Talbot's. I think I just volunteered to help Mr. Talbot and Mr. Hendricks fight the population police, she said. Lee's gaze was steady and unfailing. Good, he said. Welcome to the club. So, the next one is called, this one was, let's see. This one was Among the Betrayed. Is the next one after this book, but there are 7 in the series. So, if you liked this one, we'll see if we're going to continue the read alouds. It'll kind of depend based on if I have interest for people to want me to keep reading aloud. Otherwise, check them out at the library in town. If you need to ask or reserve them, do that. It's a pretty good series, so enjoy. And this is one of our last few days, which is quite sad. Hopefully you've enjoyed the read alouds that we've had, but now it's summertime and you guys are going to be high schoolers soon. So have a great day. Definitely send me an email through the summer. Give me updates. I'd love to hear everything. Have a great day, guys. Bye.